honestly feeling I may need to cut out the garden altogether in a minute, but we'll see how we get on. I was asked recently a question about, should it just be at our breaking of bread service, should only brothers and sisters be present? Not should they take the bread and wine, I'm happy with that, but should it only be brothers and sisters present in the room? And the question was the evidence given for that was the Last Supper. That when Jesus was in the upper room, it was only him and his disciples. And that led me to think about that a little bit. And the reason I mention it is because it's sort of affected the rest of this talk. So you need to know what's going on in my head. Because I actually thought about it and thought, okay, were the disciples at the time of the Last Supper in the upper room, were they baptized? And I would argue that they weren't. I'll elaborate on that a little bit. That actually, it's interesting that if those disciples from the upper room arrived at our meeting room, if you had a brothers and sisters only rule, then I don't think those disciples would be allowed in within it. And the reason I think that is that fundamentally, they didn't believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus at that point. So if we turn to Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 16, verse 14. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned." So at this point, and I think this is just before John 21, and then verse sort of 19, 20, just after John 21. But so at this point, and this is, after Jesus' death and resurrection, they still didn't quite believe, and they hadn't got the story. And Jesus said, "You need to go out and preach that I am raised. Yeah, you've seen me now. You believe me now. You need to go out and preach that. And those who believe in my death and resurrection will be baptized and will be saved." And we would, if somebody came in and we were sort of talking about their beliefs, they weren't a Christadelphian, but they'd been brought up as a Christian, and we could go through the Constitution, go through the statement of faith and tick off everything, except for they didn't believe that Jesus had died and been raised, then we wouldn't accept their baptism as valid, would we? We would expect them to go away and learn a bit more and come back and profess that Jesus was dead and raised, and then we would rebaptize them, and then they could join our baptism. And so I think, and I am not criticizing the disciples again at this point, but at the time of the Last Supper, that they didn't believe that Jesus would die and be raised, and so therefore they weren't baptized as we would refer to it today. They had almost certainly been baptized by John the Baptist. So we saw earlier that Peter and Andrew, and probably John, and maybe James as well, and some of the others, so Matthew maybe, had been to see John the Baptist, and knew about the teachings of John the Baptist, and so they almost certainly had been baptized in the baptism of John. If we go to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7 and verse 29. "And when all the people heard him, even the tax collectors justified God, having been baptized with the baptism of John." And so there was, so this is the teaching of, this is the teachings of Jesus, or this is John talking about the teachings of Jesus, and they'd all been baptized with the baptism of John, it says. In John chapter 3. John chapter 3, verse 22, "After these things, Jesus and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and there he remained with them and baptized," it says. And again, what's this baptism? Well, again, I think it's the baptism of John. So chapter 4, verse 1, Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. So this was, they were sort of listening to Jesus, but it was still the baptism of John, the baptism of repenting from your sins, because true baptism couldn't happen until people could believe that Jesus had died and been raised, and that was not possible at this time. And I don't particularly think this is important in actual fact within God's power. It doesn't matter whether they were baptized or not. God is quite capable of saving people before that time, without them being baptized. So we've got all the people in the Old Testament. We've got ideas that some of them went through types of baptism. So we've got Noah's flood was likened to baptism. The crossing of the Red Sea is likened to a type of baptism. The crossing of the Jordan is a type of baptism. And so there are other things that could have happened to the disciples. Their understanding and their previous baptism could have been enough. Apollos, we don't have recorded that he was rebaptized. He may have been, but it's not recorded. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus says that he will baptize the disciples with the Holy Spirit, and maybe that was enough. But just bear that idea in mind, that it is possible that the disciples were rebaptized later, and we'll see what we read as we go through then. And so we come to the upper room in John chapter 13. And I've only got to cover, you see, John 13 through to John 21, and then we'll be having our lunch. It's all good. John chapter 13, verse 4. Starts in the middle of a sentence, doesn't it? So Jesus rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel, girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. And so we have Jesus, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but we understand the symbolism. Jesus was serving his disciples to demonstrate that was what they needed to do, wasn't he? And Peter's reaction goes both ways, doesn't it? So firstly, in verse 6, he says, "Lord, are you washing my feet? I should be doing this to you. You're my rabbi. You're my teacher. You're my leader. You're the one I look up to. You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. You shouldn't be on your knees washing my feet. What's going on?" And Jesus says, verse 7, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this." And so this is a lesson that would pass Peter by at the time, but he would later have to seize on and understand. And it was that idea of serving, wasn't it? That we should serve each other, we should look out for each other, we should help each other. We should not lord it over each other. And it was a lesson that Peter did need at times. He was going to be the leader amongst the disciples, but he wasn't going to be the boss of them. And yeah, that was a lesson for Peter. But Peter then goes the other way. So verse 8, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "If I do not wash you, you'll have no part with me." So he goes the other way. "Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head. Do wash all of me then. You can't just stop there. If I need it, I need it all," he said. And in verse 10, Jesus said to him, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you." For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, "You are not all clean." And I did a bit of reading around this, because obviously I've got this idea in the back of my mind that the disciples aren't baptized. And some people talk about that, and they say, well, you are clean. He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but he's completely clean. It's a reference to the fact they'd already been baptized, but I'm not convinced by that anymore, unfortunately. So what was this then? Well, it's a reference really back to Exodus 30, I think, isn't it? And the idea that under the law, the Levites still needed to clean themselves regularly. So Exodus 30, verse 19. "For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet in water from it when they go into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister, to burn an offering made by fire to the Lord. They shall wash with water, lest they die." And so the death and resurrection of Jesus hadn't happened. There still wasn't a perfect offering for sin. And so at this time, just before he institutes the Last Supper, Jesus needs to wash their feet. He needs them to follow that idea that a washing is needed, And a greater washing will happen, but for now, it was still that they needed this to happen. And so how would they be clean from this? Well, that's the next question. If we come to John 15, verse 3, Jesus says, "You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you." So that idea of cleanliness in 13, it's because of his word. So they're on the path to salvation, aren't they? They understand most of Jesus's message, but although not quite all. In John 17, verse 17, Jesus says, "Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth," he says during his prayer, doesn't he? So they would be sanctified by God's word, by the things which Jesus spoke. And later on, these things would be put into practice. So if we go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 26. Verse 25, should we do? "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word." And it was the word that was needed in this cleansing again, wasn't it? And if we go to 1 Peter chapter 5, we see that Peter has understood this message as well. 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6. "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." And that's the idea of that Peter was told to pick up in the upper room. And Peter has picked it up, hasn't he? That we need to be humble, be submissive one to another, be clothed with humility, because God resists the proud. And you wonder, well, I'm sure Peter had taken that to heart, hadn't he? He'd seen the times where adversity had been coming upon him, where Jesus had called him Satan, because he tried to do the opposite of what Jesus wanted. And Peter took these things and brought them to mind and taught them to other people. Right, we're back in John 13 for a moment then. And we're just talking about Peter's, the account of Peter in this upper room particularly is what I want to focus on. So if we go down to verse 21, "When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, 'Most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me.' And verse 24, "Simon Peter therefore motioned to him," this is to John probably, to John to ask who it was of whom he spoke. John, find out who's going to do the betraying, because we need to do something about this." And later on in the evening, Peter has a sword, doesn't he? And we don't know for certain whether he picked it up before or after, but it's possible that his sword was in the vestibule to the room, or tucked in a cupboard or somewhere. So there would have been a risk, wouldn't there? If Peter had found out it was Judas who was going to do the betraying, there would have been a risk. And so Jesus doesn't tell Peter, does he? So Jesus answers. So John says, "Lord, who is it?" in verse 25, and Jesus says, "Look, I'll dip a piece of bread and I'll hand it to Judas, because that's who it's going to be." But verse 27, "Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said, 'What you do quickly.' And verse 30, having received the piece of bread, he went out immediately, and it was night." And so Jesus is protecting Peter at this time, isn't he? Because Peter could have done something stupid at this time with his sword or whatever. He could potentially have done something really stupid. But Jesus protects him. He identifies Judas in a way that Peter won't know about. Only John will. And then he sends Judas out immediately, and Judas does. He goes straight out, and not realizing the danger that he must have been in from Peter at this point. And it's entirely within our sort of idea of Peter, isn't it? That he could have grabbed his sword and attacked Judas at that point if he'd known who he was. But Peter at this time was protected from that knowledge. And down into verse 36, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterwards. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. And Jesus answered him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. And ultimately, Peter was right. He was going to lay down his life for his master, is what he's told in John 21, and what we understand from history probably happened. He was probably crucified, wasn't he, in the same way Jesus was. But Peter is saying, look, why can't I follow you now? And Jesus says, look, you're going to deny me, and you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. And it isn't interesting, isn't it, that I said we've got Peter and Judas at the beginning and end of the disciples list, and both were going to deny Jesus this night. Both were going to betray him in their own ways. One would lead to Jesus's death, and one wouldn't. But both were going to behave in very, very similar ways this evening. And it is, you can see how that knowledge, or the knowledge that Jesus knew it, and yet still looked after Peter in this way, must have really hit Peter later on. And that is, at least part of the reaction I think we see when we come to John 21 in a bit. And so we come to Gethsemane, and the disciples are told to sit. So if we go to Luke 22. Luke 22. I'll tell you what, I've written some notes and I haven't put any verses down. This is exciting. So when they go into this, so I think I really wanted one of the other Gospels a moment. So anyway, when they enter the garden, and 8 of the disciples are told to sit down. They enter the garden, and he says to 8 of them, you sit here and you wait. And he says to Peter and James and John, you come with me a little bit further, because he wanted them with him. And again, it's going right back to that calling, isn't it? When he sat with them for a whole day under a shelter in a garden in a similar way, possibly, wasn't it? It's we don't know, and he wanted to sit with them again. And he says to the 3 of them, he says to Peter, James, and John, he tells them to watch. And I wish I had the verse, and it might be here, it might not be, but he says to them, watch, and that word means literally stay awake. It's the word that they said to the guard. It was the word for the guard at the gate or something like that. You're the watch. You're the one who has to stay awake, and that makes it more frustrating that they don't, doesn't it? And that's exactly what they couldn't do. And so Jesus goes about a stone's throw further on, and he kneels down and prays. And what he really wanted at this point was the support of Peter, James, and John. And unfortunately, at this time, they weren't able to do it. And so verse 43, then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And so what Peter, James, and John were unable to do, that God helped him with. And if we just have a quick look at Psalm 94. Psalm 94, verse 17. Unless the Lord had been my help. Let's start in verse 16, because it's nice. Who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? Unless the Lord had been my help, my soul would have soon settled in silence. If I say my foot slips, your mercy, O Lord, will hold me up. In the multitude of my anxieties within me, your comforts delight my soul. And to my mind, those words sort of indicate to me that in the garden, Jesus came to the closest point he came from slipping from God's purpose. We know that it's, his sweat is described as great drops of blood, and we know that he was in anguish. And this was, we can't imagine it, can we? We can try and imagine it, but we can't. But Jesus knew he was going to have to go through excruciating pain and all sorts of other terrible things alongside it. And Jesus needed help, and this was the closest he came to his foot slipping. And unfortunately, at this point, Peter wasn't quite walking along behind him, was he? He'd just fallen back just when he could have done with being there, really. But God, of course, gives him this angel to support him, and God gives him the support that he needs to get through this. And verse 46, then Jesus, he goes back to his disciples. Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation, he says. And he could have criticized them far more, couldn't you? You should have been watching to help me, he could have said. But he didn't. He spared Peter's feelings. He spared James and John's feelings at this time, and forgave them for not quite doing what it was that he wanted them to do. And then comes the betrayal. Then comes the time that they come at him. So if we turn to John 18 for the account of his arrest. So John 18 verse 10, we see what Peter's reaction to it. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? So Peter's almost making the same mistake he did before. He's trying to stop Jesus going through this. Why was he swinging with the sword, do we think? Do we think he was swinging at Malchus? Do we think that was what he was doing? Or was he possibly swinging at Judas? Is this the thing that Jesus tried to prevent before when they were in the upper room? Jesus did prevent when they were in the upper room. To my mind, that's what he was trying to do. He was going for Judas, and Malchus got in the way. And Peter says, no, this is meant. Sorry, Jesus says, no, this is meant to happen, Peter. Put your sword into the sheath. And another miracle happens there, doesn't he? Because Peter gets away with it. He's not arrested. He's just attacked the high priest's servant and cut off his ear with a sword. He should have been arrested too. But miraculously he wasn't, and Jesus protected him at that point, I'm sure. And then the next significant milestone in Peter's life then is his denial of Jesus, isn't it? Again, he doesn't do badly, does he? He follows Jesus. So all have forsaken Jesus, apart from one disciple who could well be John, has gone in to the court. To the courtyard of the high priest, because he's known there, and so John potentially has gone in with him, and potentially that means that the reason that we've got such a good account, such a thorough account in John is because it was John who was there with Peter in the courtyard, although we don't quite get the whole thing there. And what happens to Peter? Well, people look at him and they say, well, you must be with Jesus, don't they? So verse 17. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And there's a hint here that she's saying, you're not one of them as well, because if you are, you should be up there with him or something, isn't there? There's a hint in how that's phrased in John. And Peter makes his, I'm going to say his first mistake of this little session. I am not, he says. And that's, if he hadn't said that, the rest of it would have been okay, wouldn't it? But starting with that lie, then he has to continue with it, doesn't he? And Jesus knew he would, but that was the start of it, wasn't it? And it's those starting times when things start to go wrong that we need to look out for, don't we? That are our downfall. And so there's this fire there, and Peter warms himself, and John tells us that at the same time that Jesus is undergoing some questioning, and And so we have this sort of consecutive account by John of Peter denying him and Jesus owning up to everything that he's done and admitting it all, isn't he? Verse 20, Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. So Jesus is being completely transparent while Peter is doing, he's being secretive and subversive in the courtyard. Verse 25 is his second denial, and it's about an hour later probably. Now soon Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you are not also one of the disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. And if we take the four Gospels together, at this point he's moved into the porch. So he's moved away from where the first maid was, it sounds like, probably. But Mark says a maid again is what Mark says. And in Matthew it says another maid, and in Luke say when Peter replies, he says, man, I am not. So there seems to be two or three people. The original maid who's saying, look, that's him. He says he's not a disciple, but look at his clothes and things. And so they come again and they say, look, and he still denies it. But of course he had to now, because he couldn't now say yes, because the first maid who he lied to was right there. And so he couldn't this time go, change it and say, no, you've got me. He had to continue with his deceit, didn't he? He was locked into that deceit because that maid was still there, and he was stuck in it. And again, Jesus knew this, and Peter would have hated it later. And then verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? And this was a bit more dangerous, wasn't it? So somebody who knew very well Malchus, he was related to Malchus and had seen Peter hit Malchus with his sword, and Jesus had protected him then. But this was a moment of danger. But it wasn't just him again this time. It was, there are others. So in Matthew and Mark, it says that thy speech betrays you. I can tell by your accent you're a Galilean. And somebody else says he's also I can tell he's also a Galilean. They can tell by his dress potentially. And so maybe there's a crowd around Peter now. And what does he do? He curses and swears. And when I think of us, do people know us by our speech? In Peter's case, it was potentially his accent, but maybe it was the fact that he didn't curse and swear as well, and he'd taken those lessons from Jesus to heart. And so maybe part of his disguise is now his cursing and swearing. He's speaking in ways that he wouldn't normally, just to deny it as well. And and yes, he denies him again. And it's interesting to think, why did he hang around? Why was he still there for that in the time of that third betrayal? Well, he loved Jesus, didn't he? We'll come to John 21 in a minute, but he had love for Jesus. It wasn't quite as good as the love Jesus showed for him, but he had love for Jesus. But he had fear as well, didn't he? And so Peter loved Jesus, but it wasn't enough to override the fear yet, and that would come later. And so in Luke 22, we have the account of the cock crowing, and Jesus turns around. So verse 61, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. And so you just can't imagine, can you, that you've been with Jesus and Jesus has done all these things for you, and you know what Jesus has done for you, and you know what Jesus is about to go through, and he turns and he looks and you go, oh, yeah, no, you got it right, Jesus. You told me 3 times. You told me, and that was, Peter's darkest hour, wasn't it? No doubt. And so Peter, he can't follow Jesus anymore, can he? He runs out. He leaves at this point, and this is Peter going the other way for a bit, and he's no longer going to follow Jesus for the next few hours. So John 20. So John 20, we have John and Peter together again, don't we? And John and Peter seem to help each other and support each other. We'll see them again in Acts later on today. And Jesus is now risen, and the ladies come to the tomb, and it is empty. Then so Mary Magdalene then in verse 2 goes and tells Peter, and verse 3, Peter therefore went out and the other disciple John, and they were going to the tomb, and they both ran together, verse 4, and John outran Peter. Potentially he was a bit younger, and came to the tomb first. And he, so John, stooping down, looked in, saw the linen clothes lying there, and he did not go in. So John comes and he waits outside. He can't quite take that last step. It's just a bit too much for him. So verse 6, Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place where it by itself. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. And the disciples went away again to their own homes. And so I don't think we quite see it earlier in the Gospels, but we see that John and Peter need each other. They are two people who work well together. That Peter can do some things that John can't, and John can do some things that Peter can't. But between them, they both go into that tomb and they believe and they understand what's going on. And it is those two together that are needed. And so that's why Jesus kept them together all the way through the Gospels. And as I was reading this, as I always do, I thought, okay, why was the napkin not there? Why was this handkerchief that he's been around his head? What's the significance of that being moved? And I don't know really. Spiritually, then Jesus's head was not bruised, was it? His heel was bruised, not his head. So his head didn't need to be covered. Maybe is the way it was. Although, of course, physically he had a crown of thorns on, so I can see a reason why you would want to bandage it. I half wonder whether the account of Lazarus coming out of the tomb when happened not long ago, didn't it? And that account, Lazarus comes out and he's still bound up, but he's still got the handkerchief on his face. And I half wonder whether Jesus said to Peter or John, whether Jesus was slightly uncomfortable by that, whether that was the thing that as this sort of it's almost a dress rehearsal for Jesus coming out of the tomb, isn't it? That this is God saying, look, I can do this for you, Jesus. And Jesus saying, look, that this is, thank you for showing me that what you're going to do to me, that somebody who is more than 3 days in the tomb can still come out. I half wonder whether Jesus was somewhat distressed by this idea of waking up and a handkerchief being across his face. And so the angel was sent to remove it so that Jesus woke and he was able to open his eyes and see. And maybe he mentioned that to Peter or John. And that's why when they went in, that's why it's that detail of the handkerchief being moved that almost seems to be the critical piece of information for them, doesn't it? But they seem to have had some knowledge about that handkerchief that was moved. And so that's the record of they go and they are now starting to believe. And then we come to John 21, which I like this chapter. I think it's an interesting chapter. I think it tells us a bit about what's going on. And so they've gone back to Galilee. So Jesus has revealed himself to them in Jerusalem as they've been in potentially the upper room. Again, he's been in amongst them on the first day of the week. He's revealed himself to various of them in various combinations. And chapter 21, the disciples have gone back up to the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus is going to reveal himself to them again. I'm in two minds about Peter at this point, and I have the feeling that he's, although it says in John 20 he believed, it seems like he's starting to turn away at this point, doesn't it? Because what does he say? So verse 2, Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, 2 others of his disciples were together. And verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said, we're going with you also. And it's almost Peter turning back from what he had previously, from following Jesus to what he had previously done. He decided that actually there wasn't anything else that he needed to do now. So he was going to follow his own path. He was going back to fishing. And so there's this problem that Peter is no longer going to follow Jesus, maybe, is what's happening here. And he's still leading the disciples, but he's leading them the wrong way, the ones that he does. And so Peter needs that final push to convert him properly, doesn't he? And so verse 4, when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So they weren't that far away out, it says, but they couldn't quite see that it was him. And yes, probably no longer weighed down by all his problems. Then Jesus said to them, verse 5, "Children, have you any food?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." And so they cast, and now we're not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. And in my mind, I have this sort of almost cartoonish idea of them all leaning over the left-hand side of the boat, and they've been fishing over there all evening, and they've been casting their nets down, and they're sort of saying, "Well, where are the fish? I can't." There's always fish, and behind them, there's all these fish poking their heads out of the water. 153 of them. And they're all sort of, doing the cartoony, poking their head out and laughing at him. But anyway, what Jesus says is, so do it on the right side of the boat. So do it on the right hand side. That is where you'll find people who believe in me, is what Jesus is saying. Those will be on my right hand side. So they cast now and were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of the fish. So this is where John is needed again, isn't it? Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So it was John who had that spark of inspiration, who recognized Jesus for who it was, wasn't it? And probably this miraculous catch of fish had reminded John and Peter of that other miraculous catch, hadn't it? But it's John who connects the dots straight away. And he says, "It's the Lord." And middle of verse 7, now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and he plunged into the sea. And I've not really heard an explanation that sort of satisfied me about this before. But what was he doing? So he put on his coat, and it says elsewhere they were naked. They were probably just in a loincloth, potentially fishing. So he put on his garment and he plunged into the sea. And I've heard it said that maybe he was trying to walk on the sea again. But it isn't what the word means. It very much means into that word there. And then I came to this chapter again, having thought, okay, so if the disciples weren't baptized at the time of the Last Supper, where else is there water? Oh, I thought. And I wonder whether Peter is casting himself in the water, whether John now believes in the death and resurrection of Jesus, because he saw that in the tomb, and now he is ready to properly commit himself to Jesus. And is this Peter being baptized? I don't know, and as I said, I don't think it's really important, but in my mind that makes more sense than the other explanations I've had. And it's interesting then when you read on, it says, then as soon as they had come to land, and that's, I think, is saying the others. So verse 8, it says, but the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there and fish laid on it in bread. So that all could be talking about the other 6 disciples, couldn't it? Then Jesus in verse 10 says, bring some of the fish which you've just caught. And Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land. So it could almost be saying that Peter has not yet got to the land. So Peter is staying in the water because Peter needs to be in the water. Peter has realized he needs to be in the water, possibly. But certainly the language seems to indicate that, doesn't it? That Peter doesn't come out of the water until he's dragging this big net with all the fish in it behind him. And again, potentially that's miraculous as well. The other disciples couldn't quite get it onto the land, but Peter could by himself. And there's 153 fish in there. And I did read some ideas of people trying to work out why there was 153 and what did 153 mean. The difficulty I have is that there weren't 153 because there were more fish on the fire, weren't there? So we don't know how many fish there were. So I don't think we can quite work out what it means, unfortunately, because we don't know how many fish were on the fire. So at least 153 and maybe, well, no, at least 154 and maybe more. But anyway, there were all these great fish And Peter was going to be a fisher of men, wasn't he? And so, yes, and sorry, the other thing in terms of Peter throwing himself into the water, there was now no more fear of death by drowning, was there? That Peter was willing to risk death in going to serve Jesus, and so he was able to cast himself into the water. And so now Peter needs to be built up. He has, I think, converted himself. He has realized what he's done wrong. He's not going to go fishing anymore. He's going to follow Jesus properly. But Jesus needs to offer him some support, doesn't he? Jesus needs to give him some guidance in what he should do. And what is he going to do? So he says to him 3 times, doesn't he? So starting in verse 15, Simon Peter, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. And we know that Jesus is saying agape. He's saying, you need to self-sacrifice yourself. And Peter can't bring himself to say that word. And I'm not critical of Peter for this at this point, and I don't, you may disagree with me about this, but I think Peter is just being realistic that he loves Jesus, but he can't quite do what Jesus does, and he's always going to quite follow short. So I think realistically, Peter is saying, yes, I love you, Jesus, but he's not quite able to commit in the same way that Jesus did. And so Jesus says, look, you need to tend my little sheep. You need to help the young ones grow. And in verse 16, he says the same thing again. Do you love me? And Peter says, yes, you know this. You know that I love you. You know how much I love you. And it's not as much as you're asking, but you know. And he says, tend my sheep. So as the sheep grow up a bit, keep looking after them. And he said to him the 3rd time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter is grieved, and I don't quite know why he's grieved at this point. Is it the repetition? I don't. It could be, couldn't it? And that's probably where he's going. But Jesus, is it the insistence that Jesus keeps asking? But this time Jesus asks him, do you love me, Phileo, doesn't he? Do you love me as much as you're saying? And Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know that's how much I love you, that I can't commit more than that, but I can commit what I've got, and I will do what I can. I'm not going to live beyond my means anymore. I'm going to try and do the things that I can. And Jesus says, feed my sheep, feed all of my flock, he's saying. And thinking about the difference between fishing and shepherds, just for a moment, just because they're sort of juxtaposed here, aren't they? You can have lots of fishermen, can't you? And they can all go out and catch fish. You can have hundreds of fishermen along the bank of a canal all catching fish. That's fine. You can only have one shepherd for a flock, I think. I think you maybe you can have an assistant shepherd or something, but there's a shepherd of the flock, isn't there? And I think we always have we have that idea. Yes, remember now we have shepherds. but to my mind, a shepherd is a one-person job. You don't have a whole group of them, do you? And so to my mind, that's Jesus saying, look, you're all going to be fishers of men, but you, Peter, have a special task. You have to be the shepherd of the flock, right? Because I won't be doing that directly anymore. And then what does Jesus say to him? He's back to this idea of feet again, isn't he? And as I said, you've got this follow me at the beginning, and you've got this follow me at the end, and you've got Jesus, you've got Peter walking all the way through, haven't you? And Jesus says in verse 18, most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. And before I came along, you were behaving like a fisherman in Capernaum. I'm sure you did all the things that fishermen did, and you knew all the cursing and swearing words, because I've heard you use those in when you denied me. But that's what you used to do, and then you turned yourself around. Well, we'll get to that bit. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and somebody else will gird you or bind you. They'll chain you up, they'll lock you, and they'll carry away where you do not wish. And it tells us, doesn't it? Is it verse 19? Yes, he spoke, signifying the death, that he would glorify God. So he was going to be bound and crucified, is what history tells us. However, what should he do in the meantime? And that's the end of verse 19, isn't it? Jesus said, you need to follow me. And so Jesus still says, do you know what? You're walking in the right way. And sometimes you've deviated and gone the wrong way. and sometimes you've done things that are stupid, but Peter, you need to keep following me, and as the shepherd of my sheep, everybody else will follow you. And that was the message that Jesus had for Peter. And I think that's great, because as I say, Peter has been following him all through his ministry, and that's what Jesus wanted him to keep doing. And incidentally, so we now have this little discussion with John, and so Peter says, what about this man? And Jesus says, well, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And it's almost has that idea that John was sitting down, and Peter said, look, he needs to be up and following me as well. And Jesus says, no, he can work in his own way. That's fine. If he wants to sit for a bit, let him. And I quite like that difference between Peter was the one who had to follow and wait for the others to follow him as well. And so, yes, this was, I think, exactly the message that Peter needed, that I'm sure he had flashbacks to all these times he tried to follow Jesus, and we've skipped a few of them, I'm afraid. But this is what Jesus wanted him to do. And so then if we just turn to Acts chapter 2, because Peter is going to follow Jesus, isn't he? And he's granted the Holy Spirit, and you've got the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And what does Peter now go and tell them? Well, he tells them all about the resurrection. So he starts his speech in verse 14, and he says, look, we're not drunk. It's only the third hour of the day. It's only 9 o'clock. Is that, I almost, so I'm a terrible person. Every time I get that, we're not drunk yet. It's only 9 o'clock. We haven't had time. But Peter then goes on to say, he talks all about the resurrection, doesn't he? So verse 23, him, Jesus, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you've taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. Verse 24, whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. And verse 25, verse 25, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, so he's raised. Verse 27, for you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Verse 28, you've made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. Verse 30, therefore, being a prophet and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of the body according to the flesh he would rise up the Christ to sit on the throne. Verse 31, he foreseeing this spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ. Verse 32, for God, this Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. So as I say, that's the difference, that before, in the upper room and before that time, that they didn't believe in the death and resurrection, and so they hadn't been truly baptized. And now he did believe, and whether or not John 21 is his baptism or not, it doesn't really matter, as I say, but now he believed in the death and the resurrection, and now he was going to follow Jesus properly, and he was going to teach this message that he understood. And in our next session, we'll pick it up when he starts to do that in Acts chapter 3. But Peter was going to lead them now, and he was going to lead them all behind him and lead him on this journey to the kingdom. And before we finish, we'll just, verse 41, those who gladly received his word. So these are the people who listened to Peter and understand it. And there's no reason why the other apostles couldn't be part of that, is there? Those who gladly received his word were baptized. And that day, about 3,000 souls were added to them. And so suddenly Peter goes from a very small flock to a massive flock. He goes to being surrounded by all these fish that he's kneeling in the boat, doesn't he? And he's getting flashbacks, I'm sure. And so this is Peter. He's been through some terrible times. He's done some stupid things. He's failed multiple times, but he kept on growing, and he kept on learning and doing better. And now Peter is ready to put those lessons into place. Thank you.